George Washington is perhaps one of the most interesting of all American figures. As a soldier, as a statesman, as the father of the country.
Without him, we wouldn't have had the revolution, we wouldn't have won it.
Back to the line!
We wouldn't have had the United States that we have today.
Washington was a visionary, but he was also a supremely practical man. He got his hands dirty whenever it was necessary.
He never led from the rear. He was up front when he shouldn't have been. People who really study Washington recognize that he genuinely embraced change.
And I think that restless dissatisfaction with the status quo was what made George Washington such a great leader.
It's 1753, and a brash 21-year-old George Washington gets his first military assignment in the wilderness of Indian country.
I recall when I was a young officer in the Virginia Regiment, I was commissioned and appointed by the governor of Virginia to visit and deliver a letter to the commandant of the French forces on the Ohio, and set out on the intended journey the same day.
He's full of himself. He's just been made a lieutenant colonel. He's leading Virginia troops. He's the commander. He's going out with an expedition to fight the French forces out that way. He's probably pretty proud of himself, and he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He's not had military schooling, and he may have thought he was a lot more competent than he really was.
We have, with nature's assistance, made a good entrenchment, and by clearing the bushes out of these meadows, prepared a charming field for an encounter.
But the encounter is far from charming. Washington has the fort built on low ground where it can be easily attacked.
Fire!
About 9 o'clock on the 3rd of July, the enemy advanced with shouts and dismal Indian yells to our entrenchments. They then, from every little rising tree, stump, stone, and bush, kept up a constant galling fire upon us.
In just a few short hours, Washington is soundly defeated. Out of 305 men, 31 were killed and 70 wounded.
He deals with the French commander. They let him march back with his weapons if he promises to go back to Virginia. He has no choice, so he goes back a defeated officer in his first campaign.
With every failure he learned, and learned from that failure to do better the next time. And with that determination, he was persistent. He never gave up. He never quit, even in the midst of failure.
It's 1776. The Revolutionary War is going badly. Troop morale is low. General Washington has to act.
Our situation is truly distressing. The militia, instead of calling forth their utmost efforts to a brave and manly opposition, are dismayed, intractable, and impatient to return.
By the end of 1776, Washington has been driven out of New York City, and he's been driven out of New Jersey. He's across the Delaware River on the Pennsylvania side. People in New Jersey are signing British loyalty oaths. It really looks like this could be it.
Your imagination can scarce extend to a situation more distressing than mine. Our only dependence now is upon the speedy enlistment of a new army. If this fails, I think the game will be pretty well up.
Washington decides on a surprise Christmas Eve attack on a garrison in Trenton, New Jersey that is held by Hessians, allies of the British. But first, his troops must cross the icy Delaware River.
2 of the units never make it across. Washington's does. Now, the Hessians were good professional soldiers, but they had had a number of false reports of attacks during the night. And they were convinced that, all right, nothing is really going to happen. So it was an intelligence failure.
Well, crossing the Delaware created an element of surprise when the Hessians were caught, because they didn't think anybody was going to be dumb enough to cross the Delaware in the middle of the winter. So the element of surprise is not something Washington invented, but he used it very effectively. It is classical in military theory.
The success of the Trenton attack inspires his soldiers. Though entitled to go home at the end of the year, they stay on to continue their pursuit of the British.
Instead of saying, okay, I've won a great victory, now we'll go into winter quarters or something, he drives deep into New Jersey by attacking at Trenton,
Fire!
beating the British at Princeton, and by going to the mountains in northern New Jersey. In those 10 days, he has completely reversed the tide of war.
Go, now.
In the 8.5 years that Washington commands the Revolutionary Army, he continually demonstrates how he expects no less from his troops than he demands from himself.
He took no salary for as long as he fought. He let the states pay his expenses, but he would take no salary. He never went home. He stayed with his troops the entire time. He never led from the rear. He was up front when he shouldn't have been, but he thought it was necessary to swing the battle when victory or defeat was in the balance. He would not take rewards at the end of the war. He was totally a selfless leader.
In 1783, after a peace treaty is signed with Britain, Washington appears before the Continental Congress and officially resigns his post as Commander-in-Chief.
Having now finished the work assigned to me, I retire from the great theater of action, bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted.
Washington refuses to become a king. His resignation was a radical departure for the time. Washington set a precedent for all American generals to follow, that the military would obey political leaders and not vice versa.
He gave us a tradition. We do not have any divine right of authority over the people, and that the military has to be a people's army. It has to be responsive to civilian leadership.
Washington's decision to relinquish power happens twice, not just as Commander-in-Chief, but also after 2 terms as President of the United States. His return to civilian life becomes a cornerstone of American democracy. February 1777. The Continental Army settles into winter encampments at Morristown, New Jersey. Hard-won victories at Trenton and Princeton have turned the tide of war in their favor. But General Washington now faces an enemy more dangerous than any British soldier.
In that day and age, it was normal that armies lost more men to disease than they did to battle. And the worst of the worst was smallpox.
Now, when the Revolutionary War begins, this is an extremely unsettling event. You have American soldiers being called from all the 13 colonies. So all of a sudden you have these people who have lived either in tiny cities or in farms, and they're all together in camps by the thousands. So the infection rates from smallpox suddenly start spiking.
Inoculation is risky. live smallpox virus is rubbed into an open wound. Washington knows a small percentage of his men will die from the procedure. But without it, he could lose most of them.
And he has to keep it secret from the British. Because the British learned that 1/3 of the American army is not effective because they're recovering from their inoculations. They might try a winter attack. So this all has to be done on the sly, all has to be done quietly. It's a huge feat of organization. And the result of it is that the Continental forces under Washington are safe from this terrible disease.
People who really study Washington recognize that he had a rare trait, rare then, rare today, and that was vision and the ability to see what could be done and to embrace change.
Washington's passion is farming. Most of his Mount Vernon acreage, like that of his neighbors, is planted with tobacco. Tobacco can be lucrative, but it is highly regulated by the British, so profits vary wildly. It is also difficult to grow in the fragile Virginia soil.
So he wasn't worried about the prestige of being a tobacco farmer. He was interested in making his plantation pay for itself. It was a business, and Washington just decided there's got to be a better way.
Starting in 1766, Washington abandons tobacco as his main cash crop, one of the first Tidewater plantation owners to do so. He replaces it with crops like corn, wheat, and flax, domestic crops for domestic consumption.
That's when he became really wealthy, when he started doing that rather than serving the British need to import tobacco, which was a loser in America at that time.
You've got to constantly be innovating. You've got to constantly ask yourself, isn't there a better way to do this?
For George Washington, the farm at Mount Vernon is a work in progress. He never stopped searching for improvements, whether borrowed or self-generated. He designs a better plow, one that won't get stuck in the farm's clay soil. He builds a threshing barn that revolutionizes wheat production. And when a patent application for an automated grist mill comes across his presidential desk, he not only approves it, but immediately orders one for Mount Vernon.
In some ways, George Washington was the Steve Jobs of his time. It was not technology for technology's sake. It was technology in service of human advancement.
In the last years of his life, Washington decides to add a distillery to Mount Vernon's growing list of business ventures. It quickly becomes the biggest and most profitable whiskey distillery in America.
One of the reasons I think George Washington created a distillery was classic business principle, which is take something and add value to it. He had grain there at Mount Vernon. Now, grain is heavy, difficult to transport, subject to spoilage. But if you take that grain and change it into whiskey, you've got something much more compact. The nutrition is much denser, it doesn't spoil, it's easy to transport. And those two things enabled him to make higher value-added product.
I mean, Washington was a visionary. He spent years of his life fighting for ideals that he had. But he was also a supremely practical man. He got his hands dirty whenever it was necessary. That's the most inspiring thing about him to me.
As most people know, Washington had his eye on the West from his young age. He personally went out 3 different times to fight the French in the area around Pittsburgh. After the Revolution, he made a trip and went down the Ohio River, checking out the land. What was it like? He didn't see the America in his vision as being just the Atlantic front. He was always looking west.
By 1760, Americans are already moving west to the Alleghenies. Washington realizes these numbers will grow, so he helps create the Potomac Company. It hopes to connect the eastern seaboard with the resource-rich Ohio Valley by improving navigation along the Potomac River.
And then, of course, if that ever happens, it's all going to be coming out of the port of Alexandria, which is just down the road from Mount Vernon. So it's a win-win. It's good for the country, it's good for Virginia, and it's good for Mount Vernon.
The Potomac Company fails as a business venture, in part because of daunting engineering challenges along the route. But Washington's vision of a nation stretching across the continent never diminishes. He advocates putting the nation's capital on the banks of the Potomac, convinced it will be a primary route westward. And in 1792, Washington welcomes Kentucky and then Tennessee into the Union, the first states beyond the Allegheny Mountains.
All of his life, if you imagine him standing at Mount Vernon and looking to what he saw as the future, he was facing west. He saw it, he believed it, he lived it. He was not facing east toward Europe. He was a man of America.